Imagine a world in flames. Cities from London to Tokyo are reduced to rubble and ash. Families huddle in bomb shelters as the ground shakes above them. A Soviet soldier shivers in the icy ruins of Stalingrad, while across the world a U.S. Marine braces himself in a landing craft headed for a Pacific beach. A Jewish child hides in a secret attic, desperately quiet to avoid the boots of Nazi soldiers. This was World War II, a conflict so vast and devastating that it truly felt like the entire world was burning. It was the deadliest catastrophe in human history, involving over 60 nations and costing an estimated 70 to 85 million lives. 6 years of total war left no corner of the globe untouched, and its impact went far beyond the battlefield. How did it come to this? And how did World War II change the course of history forever? In this video, we'll journey through the chronological saga of World War II, from the tinderbox causes to the all-consuming conflict and its world-shaping aftermath, to understand how the world that burned was reborn, forever changed. The seeds of World War II were sown in the embers of World War I. The First World War had left Europe shattered and humiliated. Germany, in particular, was forced to sign the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, accepting blame for the war and burdened with crushing reparations. This national humiliation and economic ruin created deep resentment. As the Great Depression struck in the 1930s, desperation and anger grew across much of the world. In this climate, extremist leaders rose to power, promising to restore pride and prosperity. In Germany, Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party harnessed grievances to build a fascist dictatorship, preaching racial hatred and visions of a new empire. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established a fascist regime in the 1920s, dreaming of reviving the glory of ancient Rome. Meanwhile, Japan's military leaders, facing economic troubles and inspired by nationalist ideology, sought to conquer their way to greatness in Asia. By the mid-1930s, the world was on a knife's edge. Aggression went unchecked. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931 and then launched a full-scale war against China in 1937. In Europe, Hitler openly defied the post-WWII order, rebuilding Germany's armed forces and annexing territory. He marched troops into the Rhineland in 1936, a demilitarized zone per Versailles, and the world did nothing. In 1938, Hitler's forces absorbed Austria in the Anschluss and then threatened Czechoslovakia. Hoping to avoid another war, Britain and France pursued a policy of appeasement. At the Munich Conference in 1938, they infamously agreed to let Hitler take the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia in exchange for a promise of peace. It was a false hope. Within months, Hitler broke his promises and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. While Europe stumbled toward conflict, war was already raging in Asia. After invading China, Japanese forces committed horrific atrocities, revealing the brutal character of the conflict to come. In the city of Nanjing, in December 1937, Japanese troops massacred countless Chinese civilians and surrendered soldiers. Estimates range from 100,000 to over 300,000 lives brutally extinguished. This atrocity, known as the Rape of Nanjing, shocked the world with its scale and cruelty. Yet global institutions like the League of Nations proved powerless to stop aggressors. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, Japan bombed Chinese cities, Hitler's ally General Franco ravaged Spain in a civil war. One by one, treaties were broken and norms undermined. By 1939, the tinder was laid worldwide. The world stood on the brink of an inferno, and it would only take a spark to set it ablaze. That spark came on September 1st, 1939. Without warning, Germany unleashed a new form of warfare, blitzkrieg, or lightning war, against its neighbor Poland. Tanks, motorized infantry, and Stuka dive bombers smashed through Polish defenses with terrifying speed. while from the east, the Soviet Union invaded Poland as part of a secret pact with Hitler. Poland was carved up in a matter of weeks. In response, Britain and France, honoring their pledge to defend Poland, declared war on Germany. World War II had begun in Europe. At first, there was an eerie calm in Western Europe. A phony war, they called it, as the armies of France and Britain waited behind defensive lines through the winter of 1939. But in spring 1940, Hitler struck again. In April, German forces seized Denmark and Norway, securing his northern flank. Then, in May 1940, the Nazis launched a sudden offensive westward. Bypassing France's strong Maginot defensive line, German panzers roared through the Ardennes forest and into Belgium, the Netherlands, and France, catching the Allies off guard. The speed and ferocity of the German advance were unprecedented. Within weeks, the mighty French army was collapsing and British forces were cornered against the sea at Dunkirk. It was at Dunkirk in late May 1940 that one of the war's most remarkable stories unfolded. Trapped on the beaches with their back to the water, about 338,000 British and French soldiers seemed doomed as German troops closed in. In desperation, Britain launched a daring rescue mission, Operation Dynamo. A ragtag armada of hundreds of naval vessels and civilian boats, fishing skiffs, ferries, even pleasure yachts, crossed the English Channel under enemy fire to evacuate the embattled troops. Against all odds, over 338,000 Allied soldiers were rescued from Dunkirk, an event Prime Minister Winston Churchill hailed as the Miracle of Dunkirk. This dramatic escape, pulled off by ordinary citizens and sailors, meant Britain would live to fight another day. France, however, could not be saved. Paris fell in June 1940. A stunned world watched Hitler tour the City of Light in triumph. The French government surrendered, and Germany occupied northern France while installing a puppet regime in the south. In just 6 weeks, Hitler had conquered France, a feat Imperial Germany couldn't achieve in 4 years during World War I. It seemed that nothing could stop the Nazi war machine. All that stood between Hitler and total dominance of Western Europe was Britain, a small island nation now isolated, yet unbroken in spirit. Hitler expected the British to seek peace, but Britain refused to surrender. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister in May 1940, rallied his people with defiant oratory. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall never surrender." Britain's determination would soon be tested in what became known as the Battle of Britain. In the summer of 1940, Hitler launched a massive aerial assault aimed at crippling Britain's Royal Air Force, RAF, and terrorizing the British into submission. Swarms of German bombers, escorted by fighters, attacked airfields, radar stations, and cities. The outnumbered RAF pilots took to the skies day after day, dogfighting high above the English countryside. In September, frustrated by stiff resistance, the Germans shifted to bombing civilian targets. The Blitz had begun. Night after night, German planes rained bombs on London, Coventry, and other cities, hoping to break British morale. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the Blitz, and entire neighborhoods were reduced to smoldering ruins. Yet amid the flames and rubble, the British spirit only hardened. Ordinary people endured the nightly raids by sheltering in underground stations and backyard bomb shelters, defiantly hanging on to normal life by day. The courage of British civilians and the RAF's few fighter pilots led Churchill to declare, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." By October 1940, Hitler abandoned his plan to invade Britain. The Battle of Britain marked Nazi Germany's first major defeat and proved that air power alone could not bring Britain to its knees. Even as the Blitz continued into 1941, the war in Europe widened. Italy, allied with Germany, had entered the war in June 1940, hoping to share in the spoils. Italian forces opened fronts in North Africa and the Balkans, but soon faltered. In North Africa, Italian troops attacking British-held Egypt were pushed back, prompting Hitler to send his famed General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to reinforce them. In the Balkans, Italy's attempted invasion of Greece in late 1940 went badly, so in April 1941, Hitler's armies swept into Yugoslavia and Greece to bail out his ally. One by one, the map of Europe fell under the swastika. By mid-1941, Nazi Germany dominated virtually all of Western and Central Europe, from the shores of the Atlantic to the Aegean Sea. But Hitler's ambitions were far greater. His eyes turned next to the vast lands of the Soviet Union. The war was about to enter an even more savage phase. At dawn on June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest invasion in military history, against the Soviet Union. Breaking the Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact, over 3 million Axis troops surged across a broad front, accompanied by thousands of tanks and aircraft. Hitler's aim was not just conquest, but annihilation. He saw the war in the East as a racial and ideological crusade to destroy communism and enslave or eliminate the peoples of the Soviet Union. The invasion took Soviet leader Joseph Stalin by surprise. The Red Army, poorly prepared and still reeling from Stalin's purges of its officers in the 1930s, was initially overwhelmed. The Germans advanced with frightening speed into Soviet territory, encircling entire Soviet armies in giant pincer movements. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first weeks. Many who surrendered were executed or left to die in captivity. By autumn 1941, German panzer columns had driven deep into the USSR, laying siege to Leningrad in the north, capturing Kyiv in Ukraine, and approaching the very gates of Moscow. The Eastern Front quickly became a living hell unlike any the world had seen. As the Wehrmacht pushed east, SS death squads followed in their wake, executing Jews and political commissars in mass shootings, foreshadowing the genocide to come. For Soviet citizens, the war was a great patriotic war for survival. They adopted a scorched earth policy, destroying farms and infrastructure as they retreated so the invaders could not use them. Hitler's strategy counted on a quick victory, but as the Germans neared Moscow in October, the weather turned. The Rasputitsa, autumn rains, turned Russian roads into mud, bogging down German vehicles. Then came the infamous Russian winter. In sub-zero temperatures, the invaders, who lacked proper winter gear, froze and starved in the field. Still, they pressed on to the outskirts of Moscow, where the Soviets, reinforced by fresh Siberian troops and led by General Zhukov, finally counterattacked in early December 1941. In the shadow of the Kremlin, the Red Army halted the Nazi onslaught and even pushed the Germans back. For the first time, the seemingly invincible Wehrmacht had been stopped. The cost, however, was immense. Millions of Soviet soldiers and civilians had been killed in just the first 6 months of Barbarossa, and the brutal siege of Leningrad would grind on for 900 days, starving over 1 million residents to death. Operation Barbarossa had opened the Eastern Front, which would become the bloodiest theater of World War II. The scale of suffering and destruction defies imagination. Entire villages were burned. Prisoners on both sides faced torture or execution. Yet the Soviet Union did not collapse as Hitler had predicted. The resilience of the Red Army and the Soviet people, exemplified by citizens of Leningrad holding out against starvation, and factory workers in the Ural Mountains laboring around the clock to produce tanks and guns, meant the war in the East would continue. Hitler now found himself in a two-front war he had hoped to avoid. And as 1941 drew to a close, events on the other side of the world would transform this conflict into a truly global war. On a quiet Sunday morning, December 7, 1941, the United States was violently pulled into World War II. At 7:55 a.m., waves of Japanese carrier-based warplanes descended on the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, in a sudden and devastating surprise attack. Bombs and torpedoes struck battleships lined up in the harbor, airplanes were strafed and blown apart on their airfields, and chaos engulfed the naval base. Within 2 hours, the assault was over, and the damage was catastrophic. Several U.S. battleships, including the USS Arizona, were sunk or wrecked, over 180 aircraft destroyed, and more than 2,400 Americans killed. President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared it a date which will live in infamy, and the very next day, the United States formally declared war on Japan. In response, Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis partners, declared war on the United States. The conflict that had been raging in Europe and Asia now truly became a world war, spanning Europe, Africa, Asia, and the vast Pacific. The sleeping giant of American military power had awoken, and the Allies gained a mighty new arsenal. For Japan, the attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to neutralize the U.S. Pacific Fleet and give Japan free rein to seize resource-rich European colonies in Southeast Asia. And indeed, in the months following Pearl Harbor, Japan's forces rampaged across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. Hong Kong fell on Christmas 1941. British stronghold Singapore, deemed an always impregnable fortress, shockingly surrendered in February 1942 with over 80,000 troops taken prisoner. The Japanese occupied the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, for its oil, invaded Burma, threatening India, and swept through the Philippines. In the Philippines, American and Filipino defenders, isolated and outnumbered, made a heroic last stand on the Bataan Peninsula until April 1942. When Bataan fell, some 76,000 exhausted POWs were forced on the infamous Bataan Death March, a grueling 66-mile trek under a blazing sun with no food or water. Anyone who fell out of line was beaten or bayoneted by Japanese guards. Only about 54,000 prisoners made it to the prison camp. Approximately 2,500 Filipinos and 500 Americans died during the march itself, with thousands more perishing from disease and abuse afterward. News of such brutality galvanized American resolve, painting the Japanese military as a merciless foe. By mid-1942, the Axis powers were at their high tide. In Europe, German armies occupied much of the Soviet West and seemed poised to conquer more. In North Africa, Rommel's Afrika Korps advanced toward Egypt and the Suez Canal. In the Atlantic, U-boat wolf packs prowled, sinking hundreds of Allied merchant ships in an attempt to sever Britain's lifeline. In Asia and the Pacific, Japan's empire stretched from Manchuria to New Guinea, and it even threatened Australia. The Allies were on the defensive on all fronts. It was truly a dark time. Britain and the Commonwealth fighting alone in the West until the USSR and USA had joined the fray, the Soviet Union bleeding from the Nazi invasion, and the U.S. military still gearing up for full war production. Yet, in this bleak year of 1942, the momentum would finally begin to shift. The world's free nations mustered their strength, and a series of pivotal battles would turn the tide against the Axis. In 1942, the war reached a critical turning point as the Allies struck back. The first glimmer of hope came in the Pacific. In June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy scored a stunning victory at the Battle of Midway. Alerted by broken Japanese codes, Admiral Chester Nimitz ambushed the Japanese fleet near Midway Atoll. In a dramatic reversal of fortunes, American dive bombers caught Japan's carriers off guard. In the space of minutes, bombs turned 3 Japanese aircraft carriers into burning wrecks. A 4th carrier was sunk later in the day. Japan lost the core of its elite naval aviation forces, a blow from which it never fully recovered. Midway was the turning point of the Pacific War, ending Japan's string of victories and putting Japan on the defensive for the first time. Soon after, U.S. Marines landed at Guadalcanal in the Solomon Islands, August 1942, in the first major American offensive of the war. The fighting on Guadalcanal's jungles and shark-infested waters was brutal, But after 6 grueling months, the Allies prevailed. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. As one Marine wrote in his diary, "We can beat these guys." Meanwhile, in North Africa, the tide turned as well. The British Eighth Army, led by General Bernard Montgomery, faced off against Rommel at El Alamein in Egypt. In October 1942, after a fierce seesaw battle, Montgomery's forces decisively defeated the Afrika Korps. "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat," Churchill would later say. El Alamein halted the Axis threat to the Middle East and Suez Canal. Not long after, in November 1942, Anglo-American forces launched Operation Torch, landing in French North Africa, Morocco, and Algeria. Caught in a vice between the British from the east and the new Allied landings from the west, the Axis forces in North Africa collapsed. By May 1943, over 250,000 German and Italian troops in Tunisia surrendered to the Allies. North Africa was liberated, and the Allies now had a springboard for an invasion of southern Europe. The most ferocious turning point, however, came in the Soviet Union. Hitler had renewed his eastern offensive in summer 1942, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus and the city of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The Battle of Stalingrad, August 1942, February 1943, would go down as one of the bloodiest battles in all of history. The city named after Stalin became a symbolic prize for both dictators. Months of bitter street fighting ensued, with the Soviet Red Army and city's defenders clinging to a shrinking foothold along the west bank of the Volga. The ruins of Stalingrad turned into a deadly maze. Each building, each street, was fought over fiercely. Soldiers on both sides endured hellish conditions: hunger, thirst, and the stench of death in the frozen rubble. A German officer described Stalingrad as an immense cloud of burning, blinding smoke, a vast furnace lit by the reflection of countless fires. And the sun, it is gone. In November 1942, the Soviets launched a brilliant counteroffensive, Operation Uranus, that encircled roughly 300,000 Axis troops inside Stalingrad. Trapped without adequate food or ammunition, the Germans froze and starved through the winter. Hitler forbade any retreat. By early 1943, it was hopeless. On February 2, 1943, the remainder of the German Sixth Army surrendered. Stalingrad was a catastrophe for Hitler. An entire German army was annihilated, and over 1 million soldiers and civilians perished in the battle. The Red Army had seized the initiative and would begin pushing the Germans inexorably westward. The year 1943 continued to bring Allied advances. In July, the Western Allies invaded Sicily, then in September landed on the Italian mainland. Italy's fascist Grand Council, seeing the writing on the wall, deposed Mussolini, and the new Italian government surrendered to the Allies in September 1943. However, German troops rushed in to occupy Italy and keep fighting, turning the Italian campaign into a slow, grinding slog up the peninsula. Nevertheless, the loss of Italy knocked one Axis partner out of the war and opened another front, tying down German divisions. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht attempted one more major offensive in July 1943 at the Battle of Kursk, aiming to pinch off a Soviet bulge in the line. But the Soviets were well prepared with deep defenses. Kursk saw the largest tank battles in history, with thousands of tanks clashing across the steppes, and by its end, the Germans had been decisively repelled. After Kursk, the German army in Russia was in steady retreat, increasingly on the defensive as the Red Army liberated city after city. By the end of 1943, the strategic tide of World War II had clearly turned. The Axis powers were now being pushed back on every front. Yet as the Allies gained momentum, the world began to grasp the full extent of the darkness that had engulfed it. The war's turning point also revealed its most harrowing truths. Even as Allied fortunes improved on the battlefield, the years 1942 to 1944 unveiled the horrific human cost of this global war. World War II was not only fought soldier to soldier on distant battlefields, it was waged against entire populations. It became a war of unprecedented atrocities, leaving a scar on humanity's conscience. In occupied Europe, Hitler's regime had begun the systematic genocide of millions. This was the Holocaust, the Nazis' final solution to the Jewish question. Since 1941, Jews from all over Europe had been brutally rounded up, forced into ghettos and transit camps, and then deported in cattle cars to extermination camps built for industrialized murder. At Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other death camps in German-occupied Poland, trainloads of men, women, and children were herded into gas chambers and killed with poisonous gas, their bodies burned in crematoria. By the war's end, over 6 million Jewish people had been murdered by Nazi Germany during the Holocaust, along with millions of other innocent victims: Poles, Soviet POWs, Roma, Gypsies, disabled individuals, political dissidents, and more. In addition to the death camps, countless others perished from mass shootings, forced labor, starvation, and disease under Nazi occupation. In 1942, although the full truth was not yet known to the Allied public, reports were emerging about mass killings of Jews. Some Jews fought back. In the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943, poorly armed Jewish resistance fighters held off German troops for nearly a month, preferring to die fighting than be sent to death camps. But most went to their deaths without the world's help. Only as Allied armies pushed into Europe in 1944 and 1945 did the liberators uncover the concentration camps and come face to face with the skeleton-like survivors and piles of corpses, irrefutable evidence of Nazi crimes. Battle-hardened soldiers wept at the sight of what one general called indescribable horror. The world would never be the same after witnessing the Holocaust. It forced a reckoning with evil on a scale that defied comprehension. In Asia, a parallel horror was inflicted by the Japanese military across its conquered territories, sometimes called the Asian Holocaust for its enormity. Beyond the rape of Nanjing in 1937, Japan's forces engaged in mass killings, rape, and pillage throughout China and Southeast Asia. Millions of Chinese civilians were slaughtered or died from war-induced famine and disease. Some estimates put Chinese war dead as high as 15 to 20 million. Japanese prison camps were notoriously cruel. Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers forced to build the Burma-Thailand Railway, the Death Railway, died by the tens of thousands under nightmarish conditions. The Japanese army also carried out biological and chemical experiments on living prisoners, for example, the infamous Unit 731 in Manchuria. Those who survived the Bataan Death March in the Philippines, as we saw, faced years of hunger and abuse in prison camps, or suffocated in cramped, hell-ship transports. In one incident in 1945, as U.S. forces closed in, the Japanese military forced thousands of Filipino and American POWs into the holds of ships without ventilation. Many died of heat and thirst. Such cruelty galvanized Allied resolve to defeat Japan, but it also left deep wounds that would linger for decades among the peoples of Asia. Civilians on the home front suffered immensely in this total war. In the Soviet Union, under German occupation, entire villages were massacred in reprisals against partisan resistance fighters. The siege of Leningrad alone saw over 1 million civilians die of starvation and disease as the city's people refused to surrender over 2 years. In Western Europe, civilians endured occupation, forced labor, and political repression. Resistance movements sprang up in France, Yugoslavia, Poland, Greece, and elsewhere. Brave partisans who sabotaged German supply lines, gathered intelligence, and even engaged in guerrilla warfare at great personal risk. For example, in Denmark, the resistance famously helped nearly all of Denmark's Jews escape the Nazis by ferrying them to neutral Sweden in 1943. Every occupied country had its heroes and martyrs in the shadow war against tyranny. The Allies, too, dealt destructive blows that killed civilians, raising ethical questions that persist to this day. Britain and the US waged a strategic bombing campaign over Germany, aiming to crush its industry and morale. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden were bombed so heavily that firestorms erupted. In Dresden's case, February 1945, an inferno killed an estimated 25,000 civilians in one night. In Japan, by 1945, American B-29 bombers were firebombing Japanese cities with napalm and incendiaries. The night of March 9th to 10th, 1945, a firebomb raid on Tokyo engulfed the city in flames and killed perhaps 100,000 people in a single night, exceeding even the immediate death toll of the later atomic bombs. World War II was truly a conflict with no safe havens. By 1945, the world had seen the very worst of human brutality and suffering. Yet, out of this nightmarish darkness, the light of liberation and peace was finally emerging as the Allies closed in on victory. By 1944, the Allies were poised to deliver the final blows to the Axis powers. The Western Allies had massed troops and equipment in Britain for the long-awaited liberation of Europe. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy began. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history. At dawn, some 156,000 American, British, Canadian, and Allied soldiers stormed 5 beaches along a heavily fortified French coastline. The risks were enormous. In the pre-dawn darkness, paratroopers dropped behind enemy lines to seize key bridges and disrupt defenses. Then, as the sun rose, thousands of ships unloaded troops, tanks, and supplies onto the beaches codenamed Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. German bunkers and machine gun nests poured fire onto the invaders, most savagely at Omaha Beach, where U.S. forces took heavy casualties in the blood-red surf. Yet by day's end, despite over 4,000 Allied deaths, the beachheads were secure. D-Day was a triumph of immense coordination and courage, and it marked the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany. As American G-1s pushed inland from Normandy and British and Canadian forces advanced from their landing sites, the liberation of Western Europe was underway. After breaking out of Normandy in July 1944, Allied armies swept across France. Paris was joyously liberated in August 1944, when French resistance fighters and Allied troops reclaimed the capital. One Parisian recalled the moment. "All night we heard the rumbling of the guns. In the morning, American tanks on the Champs-Élysées. People were laughing and crying, throwing flowers." By autumn, Allied forces had reached the borders of Germany. Meanwhile, in the east, the Soviet Red Army was making colossal strides. Soviet offensives in the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration in Belarus, annihilated much of the German Army Group Center and liberated Minsk. The Soviets swept through Eastern Europe, liberating Warsaw in January 1945, though tragically only after the Nazis had brutally crushed a Polish uprising and destroyed the city. They entered Budapest, Bucharest, and drove the Nazis out of the Baltic states and the Balkans. For many of these countries, liberation by the Soviet army came with a bitter aftertaste, as it often meant the imposition of a new communist dominance. But at that moment, the focus was on destroying Nazi power. Hitler's regime was now squeezed in a vice, fighting desperately on 2 fronts. In a last-ditch attempt to slow the Western Allies, Hitler launched a surprise counteroffensive in December 1944 in the Ardennes Forest, the Battle of the Bulge. In the bitter cold of winter, German panzer divisions achieved complete surprise and drove a bulge into the American lines in Belgium. U.S. troops, including the famous 101st Airborne besieged at Bastogne, fought gallantly to hold the line. General Patton's Third Army raced to relieve Bastogne just in time, and by January 1945, the German offensive had failed, exhausted of men and fuel. the Battle of the Bulge was the bloodiest battle for Americans in WWII, with over 80,000 U.S. casualties, but it also depleted Germany's last reserves. From then on, the Nazi military had little left to oppose the Allied onslaught. In early 1945, Allied forces crossed the Rhine River into Germany. In the east, the Red Army advanced relentlessly through Poland and into eastern Germany. As they pushed west, Soviet soldiers began liberating the Nazi death camps, Majdanek in July 1944, Auschwitz in January 1945, revealing to the world the monstrous genocide that had occurred. Hardened Soviet troops were shocked and enraged by what they found. Similar discoveries followed in the West as American and British forces liberated camps like Buchenwald and Bergen-Belsen in spring 1945. The liberation of the camps underscored what the fight had been about, not just territories, but a battle for the very soul of humanity. By April 1945, the Allies converged on the heart of Nazi Germany. American and Soviet troops met at the Elbe River on April 25, 1945, greeting each other as comrades in arms in a now-destroyed Germany. In Berlin, Soviet forces encircled the capital and engaged in ferocious street-by-street fighting against die-hard Nazi defenders. Adolf Hitler, hiding in his underground Führer bunker, raged at his failing generals and realized the end was near. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet soldiers only blocks away, Hitler committed suicide along with his new wife, Eva Braun. A week later, in a red brick schoolhouse in Reims, France, German envoys signed an unconditional surrender. May 8, 1945 was declared VE Day, Victory in Europe Day. After nearly 6 years of bloodshed, the war in Europe was over. Jubilant celebrations erupted in London, Paris, Moscow, and New York. In London, ecstatic crowds cheered King George VI and Churchill on the Buckingham Palace balcony. In New York's Times Square, strangers kissed and danced in the streets. But amid the joy, the devastation was staggering. Much of Europe lay in ruins, and millions mourned lost loved ones. As one war-weary Londoner put it, "It's over. Thank God it's over. But at what a cost?" Even as Europe rejoiced, the war still raged in the Pacific. The Allied campaign to defeat Japan had been a long and bloody slog across the vast Pacific Ocean. After Midway and Guadalcanal, U.S. and Allied forces had begun a strategy of island hopping, capturing key islands one by one, moving closer to Japan itself. In 1944, U.S. forces took the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Guam, which allowed new long-range B-29 bombers to reach the Japanese home islands. In October 1944, General Douglas MacArthur famously waded ashore in the Philippines, fulfilling his promise, "I shall return," after being forced out in 1942. The liberation of the Philippines culminated in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history, which destroyed much of Japan's remaining naval power. Yet, as 1945 began, Japan itself still had to be conquered. The final stepping stones were 2 Japanese islands that would go down in infamy for their fierce resistance. In February 1945, U.S. Marines invaded Iwo Jima, a tiny volcanic island only 660 miles from Tokyo. Japanese soldiers, deeply entrenched in tunnels and caves, fought almost to the last man. After over a month of brutal combat, the Marines captured Iwo Jima at the cost of nearly 7,000 American lives. A photograph of Marines raising the U.S. flag atop Mount Suribachi on Iwo Jima became an iconic image symbolizing the hard-won victories in the Pacific. Next came Okinawa, an island just 340 miles from mainland Japan, invaded on April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Okinawa turned into an 82-day nightmare of torrential rain, mud, and unrelenting bloodshed. The Japanese defenders, including conscripted Okinawan civilians, fought ferociously and even deployed waves of kamikaze suicide pilots against the U.S. fleet offshore. By June 1945, Okinawa was secured, but at a horrific price. About 12,000 American soldiers, sailors, and Marines were dead, and over 100,000 Japanese soldiers and Okinawan civilians lay dead. These battles gave a grim preview of what an invasion of Japan's home islands might cost. American war planners feared an invasion could result in up to 1 million Allied casualties, plus untold Japanese civilian deaths, since Japan's leaders were urging the population to resist invaders to the death. Facing this prospect, the United States took a fateful decision to use a new, revolutionary weapon to force Japan's hand: the atomic bomb. The top-secret Manhattan Project had successfully tested the first atomic bomb in July 1945. President Harry S. Truman, who had assumed office after FDR's death in April, saw the bomb as a way to end the war quickly and save lives that would be lost in a full-scale invasion. On August 6, 1945, a lone American B-29 bomber, the Enola Gay, dropped an atomic bomb on the Japanese city of Hiroshima. In a blinding flash of light and a mushroom cloud, Hiroshima was leveled. Tens of thousands of people were killed instantly. And by the end of 1945, an estimated 140,000 had died from the blast and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, causing another 70,000 plus deaths. Stunned by the scale of destruction and facing the entry of the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, the USSR declared war and invaded Japanese-held Manchuria on August 8th. The Japanese government finally agreed to surrender. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio address, the first time the Japanese people had ever heard his voice. The long war was finally over. Victory over Japan Day, VJ Day, brought millions out into the streets in celebration. In Times Square, a famous photograph captured a sailor kissing a nurse amid the jubilant crowds. Yet, even in victory, there was somber reflection. The world had entered the nuclear age with a terrible bang, and the moral implications of atomic warfare would haunt humanity's conscience. On September 2, 1945, the formal surrender ceremony took place aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, with representatives of the Allied powers and Japan signing the documents. World War II, the most devastating conflict in human history, had officially ended. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. After 6 years of unimaginable destruction and suffering, peace was at hand. But this was a different world now, profoundly and irrevocably changed by the war's events. The task of building a better post-war world was just beginning. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world looked nothing like it had in 1939. An old era had ended and a new one was dawning, shaped in large part by the consequences of World War II. It's often said that the modern world was forged in the crucible of World War II. And indeed, the war's legacy transformed nations, societies, and international relations in enduring ways. First and foremost, the geopolitical balance of power was completely rearranged. The once mighty European powers, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, were exhausted and shattered. No European country emerged from World War II still holding its former position of global dominance. Instead, two new superpowers rose to dominance: the United States and the Soviet Union. The US, protected by oceans, had suffered relatively little damage to its homeland and had built a colossal industrial military machine, emerging richer and stronger than ever. The Soviet Union, though devastated by the war with perhaps 20 to 27 million dead, held the largest army on Earth and occupied half of Europe. The uneasy wartime alliance between the Western democracies and Soviet communists dissolved almost immediately into distrust and rivalry. The result was the Cold War, a tense standoff between the US and USSR that would dominate global politics for the next 45 years. The world split into two blocks: the capitalist West, led by America, and the communist East, led by the Soviet Union, each armed with nuclear weapons born from World War II's technological leaps. This bipolar superpower dynamic was an entirely new international order. Europe, the previous center of world affairs, was physically and economically in ruins. In 1945, tens of millions of refugees wandered the wreckage, displaced from their homes. Cities like Warsaw, Berlin, and Tokyo were heaps of rubble. The Allied victors took on the monumental task of rebuilding and reordering the world to prevent such a war from ever happening again. In 1945, even before the war was over, 50 nations came together to form the United Nations, an international organization dedicated to maintaining peace and fostering cooperation. The United Nations, successor to the failed League of Nations, was born out of the lessons of the war, a recognition that global problems require global dialogue. Its founding charter was signed in San Francisco in June 1945, and the UN headquarters would soon stand in New York City, a symbol of American commitment to a new world order. Around the same time, the Bretton Woods Conference established the IMF and World Bank to stabilize the post-war global economy, and in 1949, the United States helped create NATO, a military alliance of Western nations, to provide collective security against any new threats, implicitly against Soviet aggression. The framework of international institutions and alliances that shape our world today is largely a product of the post-World War II effort to secure peace. For ordinary people across the globe, World War II brought enormous social changes. In many societies, the war acted as a great leveler and accelerator of change. Take the role of women. With tens of millions of men off to fight, women by necessity took up roles in factories, offices, and even the armed forces, in support roles or resistance movements. In the United States, women like Rosie the Riveter built planes and tanks, proving they could do jobs traditionally reserved for men. This empowerment did not disappear when the war ended. It fueled post-war movements for women's rights and greater equality. In Britain, women who had served in wartime industries and the military gained new respect and independence, hastening social progress. Similarly, World War II prompted advances in civil rights and racial integration. For example, over 1 million African Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces in segregated units. The contradiction of fighting for freedom abroad while facing discrimination at home was not lost on Black Americans. It sparked what was called the WWII campaign, Victory Against Fascism and Victory Against Racism. Shortly after the war, President Truman desegregated the U.S. military, and the groundwork was laid for the civil rights movement that would bloom in the 1950s and 60s. In British colonies, soldiers from India, Africa, and the Caribbean who fought to free Europe returned home determined to claim their own rights and freedoms. The war thus had a profound equalizing effect and set the stage for liberation movements on multiple fronts. Perhaps one of the most significant outcomes of World War II was the end of the age of colonial empires. Before the war, European powers ruled over vast colonies in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. But the war shattered the illusion of European invincibility and drained the old empires of their wealth and will to rule. After 1945, European colonial empires rapidly began to collapse, ushering in a wave of independence movements. The British Empire, on which the sun never set, saw the jewel in its crown, India, gain independence by 1947, after a mass movement led by Gandhi, accelerated by Britain's post-war exhaustion. Over the next 2 decades, dozens of new nations emerged. Indonesia threw off Dutch rule. Indochina fought against the French, leading to the creation of Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. Nearly all of Africa decolonized in the 1950s to 60s, Ghana, Nigeria, Kenya, etc., and new countries in the Middle East formed as the British and French mandates ended. Even the creation of Israel in 1948 can be tied to World War II. With the Holocaust fresh in mind, there was global support for establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, although this set the stage for ongoing conflicts in that region. In short, World War II truly globalized the fight for freedom. It led to the freedom of subjugated nations as well as individuals. By 1960, the world map was dramatically redrawn with many former colonies now sovereign states. This massive decolonization fundamentally changed global demographics, economics, and international relations. World War II also sparked an unprecedented period of technological and scientific advancement. The pressure of all-out war acted as an accelerator for innovation. Radar, first developed by the British to detect enemy aircraft, became a game-changing technology and later evolved into peacetime uses: air traffic control, weather forecasting. Computers were born in World War II, with devices like the British Colossus at Bletchley Park helping to decrypt German codes, and the American ENIAC soon after aiding ballistic calculations. These early computers laid the groundwork for the digital age we live in now. Medical science leaped forward too. The mass production of penicillin during World War II saved countless lives and inaugurated the antibiotic era in medicine. Surgical techniques, blood transfusion methods, and trauma care advanced rapidly due to wartime needs. In the skies, World War II spurred the development of jet engines. Both the Allies and Axis built the first jets by war's end, which would revolutionize air travel for civilians in the post-war era. Rocket technology, driven by the German V-2 ballistic missiles, became the foundation of the space race, and satellite technology. Captured German rocket engineers like Wernher von Braun went on to help NASA land men on the moon. And, of course, the most consequential technological development was the atomic bomb, which not only ended the war, but permanently altered geopolitics. The nuclear age introduced the terrifying prospect of humanity's self-destruction, fundamentally changing how wars would be deterred or fought. As Albert Einstein remarked after the war, the unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe. The Cold War's nuclear standoff of mutually assured destruction, MAD, would, paradoxically, help prevent direct great power war for decades after World War II, as the stakes of conflict had become apocalyptically high. Beyond politics and technology, World War II transformed society and culture. The sheer trauma of the war prompted a new emphasis on human rights and collective responsibility. The revelations of the Holocaust, in particular, led to a global outcry of never again. In 1948, the United Nations ratified the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, establishing for the first time a set of fundamental human rights to be protected for all people. This was a direct response to the barbarity witnessed during World War II, a moral framework meant to prevent genocide and crimes against humanity in the future. War crime trials were held in Nuremberg for Nazi leaders and in Tokyo for Japanese leaders, asserting that individuals, even heads of state, would be held accountable for atrocities. These trials were a milestone in international law and the concept of justice beyond national borders. Culturally, the war's legacy echoed through literature, film, philosophy, and collective memory. Veterans returned home and wrote memoirs or novels about their experiences, from Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead to Primo Levi's haunting accounts of surviving Auschwitz. The war introduced new words and concepts to the human lexicon: Holocaust, genocide, blitzkrieg, Cold War, Iron Curtain, and these in turn shaped post-war thought. In occupied countries and among allies alike, World War II experiences fostered a resolve to unite against future threats. In Europe, former enemies France and Germany took steps to reconcile, laying the groundwork for European integration, the eventual European Union, as a way to bind nations together economically and prevent new conflict. For the millions of ordinary people who lived through World War II, life was never the same. Those who were children during the Blitz or the siege of Leningrad carried those memories forever. Holocaust survivors who lost entire families had to rebuild their lives from nothing. Soldiers who had seen the worst of war came home changed men, often reluctant to speak of what they witnessed. And yet, out of the wreckage, people rebuilt. They started families, leading to the post-war baby boom in America and elsewhere, founded businesses, pursued education, helped by programs like the U.S. GI Bill for veterans, and tried to resume normalcy while honoring their fallen comrades. Every year since, nations hold ceremonies, Remembrance Day, VE Day, and VJ Day commemorations, Holocaust memorials, to ensure that this epic struggle and sacrifice are not forgotten. World War II's collective memory has served both as a warning and an inspiration. A warning of how low humanity can sink when hatred and tyranny go unchecked, and an inspiration in how people from all walks of life can unite to overcome darkness. World War II was more than just another war. It was a defining chapter in human history that fundamentally reshaped our world. It was a time when the very survival of civilization hung in the balance. The war's end in 1945 was not just a victory of one side over another, but a triumph of hope over despair, of freedom over tyranny, bought at an unspeakable price. The world that emerged from the ashes was forever changed, and the echoes of World War II are still felt in our lives today. From the superpower tensions of the Cold War to the map of modern nations, from the United Nations to the computer or smartphone you're using right now, so much traces back to that pivotal World War II period when the world burned and then was rebuilt. What, then, are the key lessons we carry from World War II? First, the danger of appeasing aggression. We learned that turning a blind eye to expansionist dictators or hoping that war can be avoided at all costs may only embolden greater threats. The failure to stop Hitler early on made the eventual conflict far more catastrophic. Second, the necessity of unity and collective security. World War II showed that when free nations stand together, they can overcome powerful aggressors, and that institutions like the UN and NATO are vital for maintaining peace. No country could have defeated the Axis alone. It took a grand coalition and the efforts of people worldwide. Third, the importance of confronting atrocities and defending human rights. The Holocaust and other war crimes taught humanity that evil on such a scale must never be allowed to happen again, and that we have a responsibility to protect the innocent. This directly led to global human rights efforts and the principle of international justice. Fourth, the resiliency and courage of ordinary people. Perhaps the most uplifting lesson. In the bleakest times, we saw incredible examples of bravery and solidarity. Citizens enduring the Blitz with courage, resistance, fighters risking all for freedom, soldiers liberating concentration camps and sharing their rations with survivors, nations putting aside old animosities to work together. World War II revealed the worst of humanity, but it also revealed the best: sacrifice, innovation, and an unwavering hope for a better future. The war that burned the world to the ground also forged a new world in its fire. Out of the horror came renewed commitments to freedom, equality, and human dignity, though the struggle to uphold those ideals continues in every generation. As we reflect on World War II, we honor those who fought and died, and we strive to heed its lessons. It's often said that those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Remembering World War II is not about dwelling on the past. It's about informing our present and future, to recognize tyranny before it grows, to cherish peace and not take it for granted, and to understand the terrible cost when nations fall into hatred and conflict. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the epic story of World War II. If you found this video informative or moving, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into the wars that shaped our world. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below about any personal family stories from World War II or what lessons you feel are most important from this history. By engaging with our shared past, we keep alive the memory of those who came before and ensure that the flames that swept the world 80 years ago continue to light a beacon of wisdom for future generations. Until next time, thank you for watching. Stay curious, stay compassionate, and see you in the next episode of Wars That Changed the World.